about the first was the most dramatic, because you had the backdrop of all the anxiety and the fear and the terror, and the rulers have been putting people into prison and torturing them, and so everyone was in fear because they didn't know if they'd be put into prison and tortured, and there was one great heroic young man, and he was standing up against this figure who you didn't know at the start of the show whether the figure was pure evil or pure good, because the other figure, the young gladiator, the brilliant, charismatic young hero was fighting against, it wasn't a classic narrative of good and evil at first, because the person he was fighting against had tried to be a ruler in a previous time and had been defeated, and so you didn't know whether, maybe he had a good side to him, and maybe he wasn't all evil. But then, as the show was going on, you realized that actually the older guy who had tried to be a previous ruler really was evil, and the younger guy, we didn't know. He was handsome, charismatic, good, brilliant. He was an intellectual, which is very unusual for television nowadays. And we didn't know how he would fare in his first fight, because the other man had been tortured, had been in war and conflict. He'd been a warrior before, many times before, and he'd been caught by the enemy and tortured. So the show begins, and we were all, everyone, the country is transfixed by can the young warrior, can the young man stand up to the old warrior who has been tortured and who's been through this many times before. And the old warrior refused to look at the young man. He just refused to even, when he entered the ring, he just shut the young man off, and he just gave us the same. He gave the country, he just was repeating that they were just going to accelerate the torture and horrors inflicted by the previous ruler. So, and the young man, bizarrely, even though the older warrior refused to look at him, the young man was incredibly generous. When the older warrior said things that he agreed with, he would say, "John, you're absolutely right." And and we were all watching. I mean, the country watching was shocked, because they were worried by conceding to the older warrior. When the older warrior would rain his blows down and telling him, "Oh, that was a really good shot you gave me," the country was frightened that this display of generosity towards his opponent would, maybe the judges were just so used to brutality in a ruler that they couldn't deal with a possible ruler who was generous and kind and charitable, even in the midst of battle. But in fact, after the conflict, the judges pronounced that the young warrior had won, even though he was the one who was every time the older warrior swung at him, he said, "Yes, that was a good hard blow, and I appreciate that, and I would strike the same blow." So afterwards, the judges were much taken by the younger warrior, and we realized that the older warrior was vicious and angry and frightening, and it was a classic conflict of good and evil.